Well, if the US were serious about a two-state solution, and this administration believes that settlements are a principle, if not the principal, obstacle to a two-state solution, why are you reserving these travel bans and financial penalties only to violent settlers?
This is not to forgive, but to understand, with your host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. I am your co-host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today we are joined by Omar Yousef Shehabi, assistant professor at New York University School of Law and a Doctor of Juridical Science candidate at Yale Law School. With extensive experience in international law and human rights, he previously served as a legal officer with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. Given your background and your work and history with UNRWA, the UN Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, can you share your insights and your experience with UNRWA, as it has been very prominent in the news currently?
Sure. Would you like to know what I did for UNRWA first?
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay, so I was a legal officer. The full name, by the way, is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And the works part is important, and I'll come on to why that's the case. But I was a legal officer for UNRWA on three separate occasions, once in the West Bank field office, once in the Gaza field office, and once in the headquarters legal office. And my experience working for UNRWA was an entirely positive one, deeply meaningful for me because I am Palestinian myself. And I think, really, having worked also in the UN Secretariat, I think that UNRWA is a very lean organization that gets a lot done with an unstable funding base, with 99% local Palestinian staff, of whom over 90% are refugees themselves. And that component, the works program, right, putting refugees to work in service of other refugees, providing their health care and their education and their relief and social services, it is unique in the UN, and is one of the things that would be lost if the functions of UNRWA were reassigned to other UN actors or other humanitarian actors, as there is some pressure to move in that direction.
Do you have anything to say about the controversy recently regarding that organization?
I have a lot to say about it. Well, let's start with the allegation, and I believe it's still an allegation because my understanding from the report of the former French foreign minister, who has been mandated to investigate allegations of involvement of UNRWA staff in acts of terrorism, and in October the 7th in particular, and more broadly of membership or involvement with Hamas or other Islamic organizations or militant organizations. I believe all of that is heretofore unsubstantiated. Now, there have been audio recordings released that I've heard, so some of them may well be credible, and I'm not trying to I'm not trying to minimize the severity of these allegations. If UNRWA staff members were, as is reported, involved in the acts of October the 7th, then without question they should be disciplined. But to impute, UNRWA has something like 13,000 local Palestinian staff in Gaza, right? The vast majority of whom are teachers. Mm-hmm. To impute, to punish, I should say, the 80% of the population of Gaza who are 1948 refugees, and who receive primary health care, primary education, and relief and social services from UNRWA, to punish them for the acts of 12 individuals, allegedly, would be unconscionable. And, members of the U.S. Congress have said exactly that. To the broader point I should say the broader allegation that a substantial percentage of UNRWA staff members belong to Hamas, whatever that means. They're card-carrying members of a political party, but that a fair percentage of UNRWA staff in Gaza may support Hamas, whatever that means. That would, to me, be an unremarkable proposition. Hamas, whether you like them or not, and I don't personally, is a part of the Palestinian political fabric. And only one of our main political parties, that's the Fatah party, which is the party that governs pockets of the West Bank in the context of the Israeli occupation. Only Fatah is not banned by the US and the EU as a terrorist organization. Parties of the left, like the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, also designated a terrorist organization. And so most of the Palestinian political spectrum has been proscribed, right, with the exception of Fatah. So you have the parties of the left, which are small at this point in time, not like they were historically. And you probably associate them most closely with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, right? And also to refocus the point of contestation around 1948, not just the occupation, but the overall dominance of Jewish Israelis over Arab Palestinians throughout mandatory Palestine. The center, if you will, is Fatah. This is the party of negotiations, of diplomatic and legal maneuvers to try to pressure Israel to resume negotiations and to reach a two-state solution. I worked in the last round of negotiations in 2013-14, that's a decade ago. Those negotiations never got far and were, in retrospect, fairly unserious. And so it's not a surprise to me, or shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, that the path of negotiations is a fairly discredited one amongst the Palestinians. And then you have the path of armed resistance, and that's exemplified by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and these other militant organizations.
So, Umar, you're talking about all of these different political factions within Palestine, and of course, there are different motives in this war. And I think one of my priorities is to be able to present this the complexity involved in this war. For instance, we don't just have two parties here. We don't just have the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. Since you're speaking to us about Palestine and you know Palestine so well, I want you to be able to give us an overview about how the country is divided, not just, for instance, in the way you presented Hamas and Fatah, but also the people. Could you tell us a little bit about their allegiances and how they're divided about this war?
About the war in particular?
The war, and basically probably what's been going on in terms of the conflicts, because of course we have a long history of conflicts in those lands. So if you could give us, for instance, an overview of how you see people divided over all of these big questions up to now. And I know this is a gargantuan task, but if you could just give us a bit of an overview for the audience to understand the complexity involved.
Yeah, it is a huge question, and I will try my best to avoid delving too far back into history, because our current fragmentation as Palestinians is it's pretty simple to understand. Historically, we have divides between urban people and rural folks, some level of sectarianism, although not much, I would say, relative to other spaces in the Middle East. But today, it's very much geography, right? In the Oslo Accords from 1993, the West Bank and Gaza are designated as a single territorial unit. That is the internationally accepted self-determination unit of the Palestinian people, including East Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank. The reality is most residents of the West Bank cannot enter Jerusalem except with a permit issued by the Israeli military. Gaza, since 2007, has been effectively sealed off from the West Bank. So whereas once upon a time, Gazans could go and study at the universities in the West Bank and vice versa, that isn't possible anymore. And then, of course, the refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan cannot enter the West Bank or Jordan. Jordan's a bit of a special case, but certainly the Lebanese and Syrian refugees cannot enter, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria cannot enter the occupied Palestinian territory. So we have a physical fragmentation. And that means that each segment of the Palestinian body politic, we'll leave aside the diaspora, the wider diaspora for a minute, has been left to develop its own homeostatic existence, right? So I worked in Gaza in 2017 and 18, and Gaza was a place of a lot of privation, certainly, but it was also a space that was free of an overt Israeli presence, in contradistinction to the West Bank, where you can't go anywhere without coming across a settlement or a checkpoint or a military presence. So very different realities, even within the occupied Palestinian territory. And then very different experiences amongst the refugee population as well. The majority of Palestinian refugees in Jordan have Jordanian citizenship, whereas Palestinians in Lebanon, for instance, can't hold most professional jobs, which are reserved only for Lebanese. And in certain of the Palestinian refugee camps, there is no internal law and order. So Lebanese security forces maintain a perimeter or a cordon around the camp, but they don't police the camp themselves. So the situation for refugees in Lebanon is especially dire.
What about the Palestinians in Jerusalem, in Israel?
Palestinians in Israel, right. So right, they're about 22% of the population of Israel. The majority of them identify as Palestinian citizens of Israel, not as Arab Israelis or other forms of identification. Historically, from the establishment of Israel in 1948 until 1966, Palestinian citizens lived under military rule, so they needed permits from the military to move. In the mid to late 2000s, there was a push for a democratic constitution for Israel that would enshrine democratic citizenship, not on the basis of Jewish or Arab identity. That was rejected by a majority of Israelis, which believe that Israel is a state of the Jewish people and not a state of its citizens. And since that time, you have seen the proliferation of laws that entrench the Jewish character of the state at the expense of democratic institutions and democratic ideals. The second-class status of Palestinian citizens of Israel has degraded over time, certainly over the past 20 years. The status of Palestinians in Israel who have never had distributive equality increasingly have less and less status equality as well.
Yeah. So this fragmentation that you're talking about, I'm going to now jump to a very different place because, we have a diaspora of Palestinians too. And what I've been reading is along the lines of explaining how Palestinians, so let's just speak about American Palestinians, because of course you are familiar with that category as well. And they have their own views too about the ongoing war or about the past. And what I've been reading, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but and this is not just about Palestinians, but all survivors of genocide or mass atrocity in general, that the immediate victims, the immediate survivors of a genocide tend to be a bit more subdued, usually, in terms of recounting whatever happened. And they tend to just shy away from discussing the matter anymore. And it takes a lot for them to start writing about it. The second generation, however, that is, the generation that comes after, that is their descendants, they tend to be a bit more vociferous. And as you go down the generations, the more removed it seems the descendants of survivors are, the other generations that come thereafter, they tend to become even more militant about what's going on. So what's been your experience of this? And do you think there is any truth value in what I just said?
I do. What I would say about the Palestinian diaspora is that some of us, and I would include myself in this category, have the luxury of shedding our Palestinianness, right? I was born in the US, American citizenship by birth, native English speaker. And if I chose to assimilate, I would have no trouble in doing so. If I had been born in Kuwait, for instance, as a de jure Palestinian national, de facto stateless, that I could live and work my entire life in Kuwait, and this is true of all the Gulf countries, really, work my whole life there, never acquire citizenship, and at the time of my retirement, I would be told you have 60 or 90 days to leave the country, right? So there was no shedding of citizenship in parts of the world. So, and I'm speaking entirely anecdotally here, right? In my circles, and it's a self-selecting circle because these are Palestinian Americans or Palestinian British or Palestinian Danish, you name it, who have decided to commit their energies towards working on the question of Palestine, working towards its resolution. The majority of my cousins, okay, they feel an affinity for the Palestinian people, but they haven't devoted their lives to it. They're not seeking out the cause. This generation, I am safe in saying, doesn't shy away from identifying as Palestinian, like certainly the generation before mine, and maybe my generation, where it may have been expedient to say, oh, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Arab, without specificity. I don't see that. But for those who, and to your point, for those who do decide to commit their energies to the Palestinian cause, to the question of Palestine, then yes, I would say that they are, all of the energy now is, as I mentioned, focused on returning to the original sin, right? To the dispossession and exile of the Palestinians in 1948 and the hostilities that gave rise to the establishment of Israel. And not to focus on simply the occupation as an aberration that can be solved if Israel were to withdraw from the occupied territory. But that, and I think that's, by the way, I think that's a well-founded conclusion because having worked on the last negotiations, Palestinian minimum requirements or minimum standards for a two-state solution and Israeli maximum concessions in the direction of a two-state solution are miles apart. So I think this generation, if you find them to be more vociferous or more militant, I would say it's only because they're paying attention to the facts and the details, right? Just to take the United States government, the Biden administration, its theory of the case is incoherent. And I think most most Americans who pay attention, and certainly most of the young Americans who pay very close attention, see that. So just to give you an example, the Biden administration, in the course of this attack on Gaza, has banned or instituted travel bans and financial sanctions on violent settlers or settler leaders in the West Bank. Well, if the U.S. were serious about a two-state solution, and this administration believes that settlements are a principle, if not the principal, obstacle to a two-state solution, why are you reserving these travel bans and financial penalties only to violent settlers? Why do they have to maim or kill Palestinians to be an obstacle to peace? Right? Their presence in the occupied territory, according to the administration's own theory of the case, their presence is the obstacle to peace. I think that younger folks, folks of a generation younger than mine, who are active on the question of Palestine, see that, recognize that the United States and also the states of the European Union are not good faith actors, do not have a program to get to their avowed objective of two states, and have abandoned that as the goal. And that was never a goal that was rooted in justice. That was a goal that was rooted in expedience. And there's nothing wrong with expedience if you can get there, right? I mean, I'm a pragmatist, and I'm a small c conservative. I try not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But the good is not attainable.
You mentioned the Biden administration's approach to sanctioning some Israeli settlers, as well as the Biden administration cutting off aid to UNRWA, to return back to the discussion of it. And I was wondering if you can go ahead and comment on the recent reports that have been coming out in regards to the confessions that UNRWA employees or UNRWA workers have given that may have been done so under duress and torture.
Sure. And let me just say, as I should have said earlier when speaking about UNRWA, that I don't work for UNRWA any longer, and my positions are not those of the organization or the broader United Nations. I have seen those reports. I believe the Commissioner General, the head of UNRWA himself, said that the evidence that he has seen suggested these some of these confessions, at least, were elicited by torture. There is a long and inglorious history of the use of methods of interrogation by the Israeli security forces that Israel's own judicial system has found to be, tantamount to torture. So I wouldn't be surprised by that, and I also wouldn't be surprised if, subsequent to October the 7th, you've heard a fair amount of testimony by Israeli soldiers who have served in the most recent ongoing military campaign, who have said, in essence, that the rules of engagement have been liberalized, almost in the spirit of vengeance, relative to prior military campaigns. So I wouldn't be surprised if the methods of interrogation have similarly been loosened, as occurred in the United States after September 11th, and that's part of the American inglorious legacy of torture as well.
So what is it that you have experienced? And I think this is something that's important, a question to me, because we're scholars here, and I often wonder the question, what is all of this scholarship about? Where is it going towards in dealing with the ongoing conflicts, in dealing with the long debates about the Israel and Palestine question? My question then to you is, because you've had some experience dealing with organizations at the practical level, What was your experience dealing with them where they tried to solve the Israel and Palestine question? Do you think there is hope in them? Do you feel skeptical about their ongoings, their workings rather, their modus operandi?
When the current Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, when he came into office in 2005, he said, the alternative to negotiations is negotiations. In other words, this is sort of in contradistinction to Arafat with his, I have an olive branch in one hand and my freedom fighter's gun in the other, right? This is saying we're committed exclusively to the path of negotiations, and if we fail, we will just try again. So that was 2005. Yasser Arafat died in November 2004. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, became president in January 2005. So we are about to enter the 20th year of his 4-year term. And in that time, there have been 2 rounds of negotiations in 2007-8 and in 2013-14. And whereas the 2007-8 negotiations were somewhat substantive, although less than the negotiations that were conducted at the end of the Clinton administration at Camp David and Taba. The 2013-14 negotiations on which I worked, in theory at least, were not substantive at all. Or they were, maybe that's uncharitable, they were substantive as between 2 parties, as between Israel and the United States, in essence, standing in as a proxy for Palestinian interests and front-loading negotiations on security issues. And then the U.S. Team headed by an American general, which negotiated with the Israelis on the behalf of the Palestinians, then put the outcome of that to the Palestinian leadership and said, here's what we've negotiated on your behalf as regards to security. And now we can move on to other issues like territory and refugees and water and Jerusalem. And that approach got nowhere. But the Palestinians were never really engaged in the negotiations in 2013-14, other than to be presented with an American fait accompli and said, take it or leave it. And there's a reason why the Americans did it that way, trying to avoid the pitfalls of the last negotiation. But I don't believe that there's any horizon for negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And so insofar as the current strategy of the Palestinian leadership is to sort of replicate the strategy of forcing South Africa to withdraw from Namibia, that is very much is the playbook. We can discuss that at length if you want. I think that is the right strategy. There's no negotiation that can be had from the place of historic weakness that the Palestinians currently occupy. Now, in theory, the United States, which has tremendous leverage over Israel, but is tragically afraid to exercise that, as is being shown in the current horrors in Gaza. In theory, the U.S. could address the power imbalance by making demands of Israel and by conditioning military aid and diplomatic support on Israel meeting certain minimum standards for a Palestinian state. But that's not going to happen. On 25 years of evidence, that's not going to happen. And so while the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian government in the West Bank is unpopular, and perhaps even discredited entirely, its strategy right now is, in my estimation, the right strategy, right? I wish there were more consistency in following that strategy. there haven't been. There have been unnecessary concessions made. There have been mistakes made. But no, I don't believe that there's a political horizon now for negotiations. And, again, politics for the Palestinians is not based on infrastructure or schools or, tax policy. It is based on subjugation or steps towards liberation, right? And as we've discussed, there's only a certain number of routes or strategies one can pursue towards liberation. And if you are an average Palestinian, then you've seen the bankruptcy of 20 years or 25 years of negotiations. It would be insane to believe that the same strategy is going to yield dividends going forward, and virtually all Palestinians don't, which is why when you see public polling of the Palestinian leadership, it's in the low to mid single digits.
So my question is now about how the scholarly community, generally speaking, and I don't want to make a generalization, but based on a lot of the articles I've been reading, the commentaries by them, they seem to have given up on the two-state solution. And then sometimes it has, well, when I say that, I also do have to mention that I do still see it popping up on and off. But based on what you have experienced, your commentaries just now on the practical realities of these organizations that have obviously failed in achieving their objectives, which is why we're here now. My question is again, probably going to be oriented towards now the future. With all of the failings of these activities, these organizations, these negotiations, and with the G question right in front of us right now, the genocide question, what is your opinion about how we should move forward right now in terms of solving the problem?
I would say two things. Possible outcome, right? Two-state solution can mean any number of things, any number of, in particular, of confederal arrangements, right? So there could be an Israeli Palestinian confederal. I mean, don't forget the partition plan of 1947, the General Assembly's partition plan, was in essence a confederation. It was an Arab state and a Jewish state with an international zone for Jerusalem, with guaranteed rights for Jews who would remain in the Arab state and for Arabs who would remain in the Jewish state, linked together by a customs union with free movement between them. What's old is new again. And you see a lot of promising thought and movement building around a confederal arrangement now. Now, it seems in these genocidal times, that may seem far-fetched. But I would suggest to you that it's no more far-fetched than the idea of two states along the traditional model that was anticipated under the Oslo Accords of two separated states, right? With your normal sort of attributes of sovereignty. I don't think that is a promising model anymore, principally, and of course I'm a partisan, but principally because there is no, I can't envisage an Israeli government in 2024 or 2034 or 2044 that would ever agree to that. I mean, the population of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is about 700,000 people now. That is roughly 10% of the Jewish population of Israel. That block of settlers and their leadership play a kingmaker role in any Israeli government now. And the folks who lead the ideological wing of the settler movements, and this is from the mouth of my Israeli friends and colleagues, they don't think of themselves as politicians. They think of themselves as biblical heroes. So if you were to ask these folks, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, how does it end if we colonize the entirety of the West Bank and even reconstitute settlements in Gaza? And then we have these, we consign the Palestinians to these this archipelagic existence of the major Palestinian cities, hemmed in by settlements. How are we going to rule that in a way that isn't apartheid? And the answer of these folks is to point up and to say, God will resolve it. And if it means expulsion to Jordan, potentially, if it means some messianic war, so be it. But this is land promised to the Jewish people, and we will. So these people are not, these people on the far right, this is something that my friends try to impress upon me. They don't think as normal politicians, right? They're taking preparatory steps for a messianic solution. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be a coalition that can form a government in Israel and exclude the far right. But I have trouble seeing it.
So I think, Umar, you mentioned the apartheid, and I just want to speak from an audience perspective of things. I only started, I'm privy, of course, to the news. I don't have any direct connection with Israel or Palestine. But there are many terms now that we're struggling with. We're trying to define these terms, for instance. We're trying to write elaborate articles about what these terms mean and how they're misconstrued. So the fight between the war between Israel and Palestine, many terms have emerged: Zionism, anti-Semitism. We have also, this controversy about the use or the reference of the Holocaust to whatever happened on October 7th. And of course, on the Palestinian side, we're referring to the Nakba many times, and a repetition of that. There's a new term now which we're using, which is what you mentioned, apartheid. So what do you feel about the use and the circulation of these terms by the public, by the journalists, by the political factions involved? Any thoughts?
I have no issue with the use of apartheid in this context. Apartheid is, yes, it elicits memories of South Africa. It comes from the Afrikaners language, but it's part of English. It's part of the international law, right? There is an apartheid convention, 1971, and so look, genocide was not a concept in existence prior to Raphael Lemkin, right? So legal concepts are created, and they may elicit memories of particular episodes in history. All right, but the Turkish persecution and mass murder of Armenians was a genocide, although there was not a term yet coined for that phenomenon, right? And so there doesn't need to be complete analogy to South Africa for the situation in the combined space of Israel-Palestine to be a situation of apartheid. Now we can debate, and people on my side do debate, whether the situation of apartheid exists only within the occupied Palestinian territory, in the West Bank specifically, where you have two national or racial groups living under two sets of laws with very different freedom of movement and the like, or whether the entirety of Israel-Palestine, including the condition of Palestinian citizens of Israel, is also part of that, whether in the entirety of mandatory Palestine or Eretz Israel, whether the condition of Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs in that entire space is one of apartheid.
could you enlighten us a little bit about how similar you think the conditions are in Palestine and the occupied territory, uh, and how different they are from the apartheid we know in South Africa?
Well, I should give the caveat that I'm not an expert on apartheid South Africa, but I do think there is similarity between the past laws in South Africa and the lived reality that I experienced living in the West Bank. Now, don't forget, I worked for the UN. So I drove a UN-marked car with a diplomatic or a UN license plate, which has the diplomatic privileges, which means I breeze through every checkpoint in the West Bank. I breeze in and out of Jerusalem. The car isn't stopped. When, however, I was driving my private car, very different experience, right? Now, I had a car with the Israeli license plates, which are yellow. But I was stopped at a checkpoint, speak my broken checkpoint Hebrew, I called it. They would know that I was not an Israeli Jew. And then, there was more questioning. The car would be inspected, open the boot, open the hood, step out. Where are you going? These sorts of things. If I were a Palestinian with a West Bank ID, that is to say, not a Jerusalem ID and not an Israeli ID that the Palestinian citizens have, I would not be allowed out. I would not be allowed into Jerusalem. I would not be allowed into Israel. All right. So I'd have a white-plated car, and that would restrict me to the Palestinian road network. And it would prevent me from entering Israel. And it would also not allow me to use certain checkpoints. So even where I could cross, there are certain places I couldn't go. So there is very much a border between the West Bank and Israel for Arab Palestinians. There is no border for settlers or for Israelis, right? And in fact, the settlements are serviced, especially the larger settlement blocks, are serviced by these newly constructed 3 and 4 lane highways, which give uninterrupted access to and from Israel, right? So for the settlers, there is no border.
So the last time we spoke, you did mention something particular about the identity of the people of Gaza. And you also spoke about how they excelled in certain domains. And I think this is something that struck me because I don't think we think about this as outsiders. I say outsiders because, as I said, I'm not connected directly to Palestine and Israel. But I was really marked by what you said in terms of the struggles they go through. And I also want you to talk about, I think, was it in 2014 or 2017 that you spoke about the additional restrictions that they had to endure in terms of their access to utilities, to electricity. And I think lastly, when you're talking about all of that, I also want to hear more about the involvement of other countries in the Gulf and elsewhere that have tried in the past to come to the aid of this community.
Yeah. So when I lived in Gaza, it was in 2017 and 18. Gaza's only power plant, which is in the middle area, was significantly damaged in the 2014 war, and did not produce enough electricity to meet needs. Now, Israel provided some power to the northern Gaza Strip, Egypt to the southern Gaza Strip. Most of the power came from this power plant, which was crippled in part. So the power in Gaza when I was there was between 4 hours a day and 8 hours a day, and usually cut at night, no matter what. And I think I told you before that in the 2 years that I was there, the highest score on the Palestinian matriculation exam, which is called the Tawjih, came from Gazans, who are, I guess, studying by flashlight and generators or whatever else. It really is an impressive achievement that the education system has remained so intact. despite the separation from the West Bank, despite the Israeli restrictions on the movement of persons and goods since 2007. So that the blockade has ebbed and flowed over time, as has maritime access. Obviously, the Gazan coast is controlled by the Israeli Navy, which is why these flotillas that are scheduled to float from Turkey to Gaza they will be interdicted in the waters off of Gaza invariably. When I was there, it also overlapped with the speaking of blockades, the Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian blockade of Qatar. And basically, the Saudis were trying to break the independent streak of the Qataris, right? Not following sort of the Gulf consensus as it pertains principally to Iran, but its entire Qatari foreign policy, which is independent of the other GCC states. And that effort failed, but while I was there was a competition between the Qataris and the Saudis to show their beneficence in Gaza, right? So there were rehousing projects that were funded by the Saudis. There was road infrastructure and sewer infrastructure improvements funded by the Qataris, and a fair amount of money was coming in at that time. And it was a competition for the hearts and minds of the wider Arab world, with the Palestinians as a point of real heartfelt commitment on the part of the Arab peoples, right? However, UNRWA is in this dire position now with the U.S. having adopted an appropriations law that bars funding for UNRWA through at least the spring of 2025. And I've written about the need for UNRWA to break itself free of its history, which was intended to promote the resettlement of Palestinians into the neighboring Arab states at the expense of their repatriation or return to their former communities in mandatory Palestine for Israel. And UNRWA has tried over time to diversify its funding base and get more funding from, if not the global South, from the Gulf and from other non-Western wealthy states. And that effort has largely failed. The point I've made in my writing is that UNRWA has been trying to get money from the Gulf without really changing its orientation from its very decided Western focus, right? So what the Gulf states would be funding if they funded UNRWA now would be funding an organization that has been disfigured by the funding conditions imposed by the United States and by the European Union and by the major European donors individually, right? So UNRWA uniquely among UN system organizations has this bloated bureaucracy that is there to ensure that the curriculum taught in UNRWA schools teaches a so-called, a curriculum of peace, right? Tolerance, of universal values, humanist values. What that really means in practice, and I know because I was involved in this for quite a long time, is it's pruning off parts of the Palestinian national narrative, which is one that is born on, rooted in dispossession and exile and suffering, and say, no, we don't want to teach that anymore, you know. But that is our national narrative. That is our tragic national history.
So you spoke on the U.S.'s ability to go ahead and have this impact on UNRWA, and we can also go ahead and see the U.S. potential leverage that it can have on Israel. Now, the U.S. is in action in going ahead and taking this leverage against Israel. We can go ahead and see that there are grassroots movements, especially in the protests that are happening in current U.S. campuses, as well as abroad, and most recently in France and Australia, where the citizens of some of these nations are able to go ahead and put pressure, or trying to put pressure upon their institutions, whether universities or otherwise, to disinvest in Israel or in companies that are going ahead and funding or aiding in this conflict. And given your history and your experience with NYU, I understand, as well as your current affiliation with Yale, and the current protests happening in Yale being often displayed on the news, do you have any insight into how this is going ahead and affecting the situation as it is right now?
Well, I'm personally amazed by the level of student activism and the intensity of the student activism in the face of an extremely illiberal response by these supposed, bastions of liberal values. I can say that when I was an undergraduate 20 plus years ago, the organization that is now Students for Justice in Palestine was a bunch of disaffected Arab men like me sitting around and airing grievances. It had no political program. Whereas you compare that with what has replaced SJP and Jewish Voices for Peace at Columbia, which is this Columbia University Apartheid Divest, CUAD, which has a very clear and well-formulated manifesto, if you will, or platform, and is using these democratic institutions that Columbia has established to inform its investment decisions, including referenda, and putting Columbia in the awkward and, in my mind, indefensible position of having to just ignore the will of the student body, which, Columbia and Barnard have both previously adopted divestment resolutions. The administration has ignored them, and now the administration is saying, well, it's divisive and there's no university consensus on these things, and so so again, the student body is organizing these resolutions. What you see happening at NYU and at Yale has been much more direct action, and the response of Yale and NYU. Of course, I've received the emails from the administration of the university and the law school in both places. And if you were to put the two responses from the university president side by side, I mean, they're almost indistinguishable, claiming that the protest has been infiltrated by outsiders from the community, that there have been reports of anti-Semitic chanting and conduct that makes pro-Israel students, and including Jewish American students, feel unsafe. But what you never see in these statements is any kind of interrogation of the concept of unsafe, right? What does unsafe mean? Is it you're getting vibes that you don't like because they conflict with your ideology? That's what university is all about.
I mean, it's interesting we're talking about all of this. I listened to a very interesting program about the scholasticide that happened in Palestine, where all the universities were destroyed, by the Israeli forces. And so it's good that we're talking about this question. What can the world do? And I'm not just speaking about Americans, but the world. I've been exposed to different countries, and even Mauritius, where I come from. it's a divided society right now on this question about the war. People are taking sides, and I've lived in Malaysia as well. Again, that's a very interesting country in terms of its own view on the war in Israel and Palestine. So my question to you is, a lot of us are, our commitment to our ethical commitment to nonviolence, we all want to do something. I don't think we just want to be consumers of what's going on there and in terms of just watching these videos from morning to evening. What can we do, according to you, to make sure that we are also showing our support for the victims, for the families, and for a future where there's going to be at least a ceasefire and where there's going to be an end to this terrible carnage?
I don't think I can offer you much optimism. You started first talking about the scholasticide. This is a term that has been coined recently, and I think it will probably be, a term used in currency going forward. I worked at UNRWA. The campus of Al-Azhar University and the Islamic University of Gaza are just across the street from UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza. So I know the area well, and I've seen the images of that space where I used to see students. They're not big, and so when in between classes, the campus would just be mobbed with students. Seeing the pictures that I've seen of that space now, the wreckage of the two universities and other universities in Palestine, is heartbreaking. I mean, I think in the immediate term, before those universities can be rebuilt. And don't forget, half of Gaza's population is under 18. So the school age and university age population is very large. There needs to be a concerted effort to find places in the neighboring states and in the West for students to continue with their education while Gaza is being rebuilt. As for how it is rebuilt, that is also going to be an issue of contestation. So after the 2014 war, there was this tripartite agreement between Palestinian Authority, Israel, and the United Nations called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, the GRM. And it was this Byzantine system of tracking the import and the distribution of all material that Israel considered to be dual use, which was in essence anything other than wood and sand. So anything that had rebar or concrete or whatever was tracked through this elaborate computer system, added layers and layers of bureaucracy and delay, and impeded the reconstruction of Gaza. If you're an out-of-work humanitarian professional, these things are great. If you are a Palestinian who needs to have your home rebuilt or your school rebuilt or your office building rebuilt, not so great. So we need to see a paradigm shift for reconstruction relative to what has occurred in the past. In terms of what folks can do now, there are any number of good charities doing their very best to distribute aid. That is, of course, inhibited by a number of choke points, one being the crossing points into Gaza and the various security inspections and security requirements Israel has established. So you've heard reports of, for instance, little medical kits being entire truckloads being rejected because they carry medical kits, and medical kits have a pair of surgical scissors in them, and the entire consignment is rejected, and the truck has to go back. You have that, and then also issues of coordination and conflict de-escalation, right? To allow for convoys to go into areas, conflict zones and areas near conflict zones, right? So even when there is coordination, like this World Central Kitchen convoy that was blown up, they had coordination with the Israeli authorities, and that was a mistake. We're led to believe it's a mistake. These mistakes happen, and they discourage other humanitarian actors from attempting to deliver into those areas as well. So it's getting food into Gaza, the Gaza Strip is one thing. Getting food and medicine and other supplies, essentials of life, to the parts of Gaza that are, at most acute risk of starvation is a different story. You still have to get somebody who's willing to risk their life to drive the truck to these communities that are under siege. But all I would say is, if you do your homework on your charity of choice, and this is the best we can do at this point in time. And then when there's reconstruction be done, contribute to that as well.
Omar, thank you for speaking to us. Our sincere sympathies go to the people of Palestine and Israel for all their sufferings, because they have been victims on both sides. Thank you.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Omar Yousef Shehabi. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.